Welcome as we investigate John chapter 13. We will begin with the outline. The first 20 verses are basically a story of the foot washing. So there comes in two parts. It's his foot washing and then the message he has after the foot washing. That is then followed in verses 21 through 30 by Jesus' essential interaction with Judas. Now, the interaction with Judas is very short, but we have the prelude and the postlude of those things. 31 through 35, Jesus now starts to clarify to the remaining people who are gathered there about his purpose. They don't quite understand that. And so we have a question again about where Jesus is going, this time from Simon. So 36 through 38 is his interaction with Simon, who is also called Peter, and the prediction of the betrayal by Peter. There are a lot of themes that show up in chapter 13. It's a very intense passage. But if we look at the foot washing, then one of the first things that comes out is that it is Jesus' hour. Knowing that his hour had come. And so that takes us back to a little walk through John 4 with regard to the hour of Jesus. So if we go and look at John chapter 2, we see the first reference. You may still remember this. It comes in his discussion with his mother, right? What does this lack of wine have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. The next mention of his hour is in chapter 7. Right? As we look at chapter 7 towards the end in verse 30, we find that they were seeking to seize him in the temple. So we are now at the Festival of Booths, and this would be chronologically, since 7, 8, and 9 and part of 10 are the same festival. This would be the fall prior to his death that we're now at right now, so approximately 6 months prior. So he says, there's eager to seize him, but no man laid his hand on him because his hour had not yet come. If we then go to chapter 8, verse 20, we have again another confrontation during the same festival that Jesus is dealing with. And it says he was speaking in the treasury and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. And then we end up in chapter 12. We have the entry into the city, and we have a mention in verse 23 where Jesus answered and said, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." So the Greeks come, and that sets up the hour. And so it's only a few days between chapter 12 and the next occurrence in John 13. And so that hour of his coming, it is a reference not merely to a time during the day. So we have a chronos, right? Chronometers, measuring of time. We have watches. Those are chronometers. They measure time. But then there is a time or a season if we go to Ecclesiastes. And that is an appointed time, a moment when all things kind of wrap up and come together. It's the time for harvest. That's one way of looking at it. But they use the term hour in this particular gospel. So it's Jesus' hour has come. And so things are rapidly moving further and further towards the end. So we have the sunset behind me. because things are starting to set, and the light is not always going to be among them, as he has mentioned. The second term that comes out of there is that of love, right? Jesus knows his hour has come, and he has loved his own, and he loved them unto the end, right? We talked a little bit about phileo and agapao previously in the relationship between them, right? And here we have them using agapao. Right? He loved his own who are in this world, and he loved them all the way to completion. So the end is a completion idea, right? But the love that Jesus has. So that takes us right back, hopefully, if you're thinking of the story, to John chapter 3. And when we get to John chapter 3, God loved the world. He gave his only begotten Son. God did not send the Son to judge, but sent the Son so that the world might be saved through him. So the purpose of his coming is to save the world. And he is now going to do that. That's the hour. And it's an hour of glorification. Glorification meaning his exaltation. But John is using that in a metaphorical tense as opposed to what Paul might say, where he's exalted to the right hand of the Father. Here his exaltation, his exaltation is his death. And so love like that which Jesus possesses is one that goes all the way through with the task that needs to happen. There are other themes that are in there, right? He's now departing to the Father. So there's the ascension motif. There's the concept of him being a servant as a model for everyone. But the other thing we want to look at are the truly, truly statements. Now, these go back to the very beginning. In John 1, it shows one time. John 3 has 3 different components. Chapter 5 has 3 different components of truly, truly statements. John chapter 6 has 4 of them. The bread of life discourse. John 8 has 3. John 10 has 2. John 12 has 1. And then once again, there are 4 in this section. As we look at those, right, we see that they are important. Right? As we get into verse 16, Jesus says, I gave you an example. Truly, truly, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one sent greater than one who sent him. So Jesus is not claiming to be greater than God. He's claiming to be sent by God. And as we will find later on in the resurrection appearances, he also sends his disciples. So they are not greater than Jesus because they are sent. And in verse 20, he repeats this truly, truly idea with that he who receives whomever I send receives me, and who receives me receives him who sent me. So to receive, to take Jesus is to take the Father, right? To receive one whom he sends, and a disciple going forth, is to receive Jesus. So he's dealing with some very complex ideas here. Now, some people are confused a little bit about the washing scene, and there's 2 different words in Greek that are used to wash, and they're very specific. We are not a specific language in English. So wash could be anything, or if you're from Oklahoma, as my mother was, wash, right? The washing of clothes. But to wash could mean to simply wash your face, or it could be to bathe completely. And so in the discussion with Peter in verse 5, he began to wash the disciples' feet, which is only to wash part of the body. Nipto is the Greek word. But Peter, when he comes to him, says, you shall not just wash my feet, right? And Simon says, so then wash my hands and my head, right? So luo is to wash the entire body, right? So there's a idea here of washing parts and washing the whole thing. But Jesus, right, the one who has bathed, needs only to wash his feet. So if you're clean, you only need to take care of a little bit. But if you are not clean, you have to be fully washed. A lot of discussions about this, perhaps some of it related to baptism. Some people think that it might be. Other people have it being simply one of those other messages of Jesus that is in the world of analogy and metaphor and could be taken far astray, but we don't want to take too far astray. Second section of the Judas instructions, right? Jesus comes to the disciples and says, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. Well, we know from the truly, truly statements that he's really emphasizing the reality of this. And the fact that one of them will betray him is quite upsetting. But betrayal in this term simply means to hand over, to hand him over to the others, right? Someone will betray me and they will paradidomi, hand him over. And then you actually hand him over to the authorities. But paradidomi does not always mean betray, because it's also used in Corinthians 15, where Paul says, for what I received, I also handed over to you. So it's a transmission word as well. The context does matter. So they're wondering what's going to happen about this betrayal. And then we have the beloved disciple asking, who is it? So the disciples don't know what he's talking about. And then Jesus gives a image, and they are clueless to Judas, but we know about Judas from chapter 12 and also from chapter 6, thinking that he just is going to buy something. So even though he said somebody's going to betray him, he doesn't realize that. And the disciples simply don't know. No one knew what purpose he had said this to Judas. The disciples are undiscerning. Without the Spirit of God, we don't discern the activities of God because we have not been born of God. So in the last section, as Jesus starts to speak and teach the disciples, right, he talks about time for glorification. Now, this sounds very reminiscent of chapter 12, right? But it's also been brought to us in chapter 7, verse 39, chapter 8, verse 54, and John 11, 4. So if we just take a look at John 11 very quickly, right? Jesus says, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. We drop down to chapter 12, and we get to where the Greeks enter, right, at verse 23. Jesus said, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And again, in verse 28, he says, my soul has been troubled, right? For what purpose I came to this hour? The hour is present, the hour of his exaltation. Glorify your name. And a voice came out of heaven saying, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. So that then brings us down into chapter 13 and the words of Jesus to his followers. It's time for the Son of Man to be glorified, and by doing so to glorify God. And if God is glorified, God will also glorify him. And they're probably still misunderstanding what's happening. But now we understand that he's talking about himself. The Son of Man is a third person reference to himself. Rather than say, I am, says the Son of Man is. We saw that in chapter 9. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And who is this Son of Man? The blind man says, I've never seen him. Okay. And so Jesus is talking to them, and we have, once again, one of the more popular things. You will seek me, as I said to the Jews in chapter 7 and 8, where am I? I'm going, you cannot come. Questioning all of that. A new commandment I give you, love one another. Just like I loved you, love one another. Well, how has he loved them in chapter 13? He loved them even to the end. So that's the type of love that we are being told to follow him. And just in case anyone's wondering, in this case, he is using the word agape. He can switch back and forth between phileo and agape when he wants to, but this agape love in chapter 13 is love to the end. And so just as the Jew said, where are you going? So Simon Peter says, where are you going? And we have the discussion with him. It says, you cannot follow me, but you will follow me later. And says, why not? I would be one to die for you. And he says, really? I don't think so. You're going to deny me. And that's how chapter 13 ends, in a very, very low spot. The sun is setting, right? And you will deny me because, well, it is bound to happen. So the idea that the disciples knew what was happening and we would be better in their place is probably not a good way to read this, because if we don't have the Spirit, we don't understand the words of Jesus. That's one of the main teachings of John. So we're going to bypass the final discourse of John 14 through 17. Now, doesn't mean this is insignificant. It's a very significant part. In fact, probably an entire class could be taught just on these 4 chapters. So the next video, we're going to come back and look at the passion of Jesus and resurrection. Thank you.